It's been some time since we did a mitzvah in our mitzvah series. I was quite embarrassed when I looked it up. When was the last time we did a mitzvah in our mitzvah series? It was more than a half a year ago. And I've kind of been neglecting it. And that's unfortunate. But we're back. We're back. We're up to mitzvah number 149. And today we're going to do mitzvah 149 through 152. And these are all mitzvahs that relate to priestly decorum. If you're a priest, you're working in the temple, you're working in the tabernacle, there are certain requirements, certain behaviors, certain restrictions, certain prohibitions that you must obey. Number 149, is not to have overgrown hair. You might like the look, the bushy look of the overgrown look, the mop look. The kids today are into the broccoli look. You might like it. It's not permitted in the temple. To not have ripped garments. Your garments must not be ripped at all. They are prohibited from leaving the temple grounds in the middle of service. If they're in the middle of doing one of the services in the temple, they cannot leave in the middle of the service. And finally, they cannot enter the temple inebriated. And certainly they cannot do any service in the temple when they are under the influence. Now, all these four mitzvos appear in the Torah in chapter 10 of the book of Leviticus. This is in the aftermath of the death of Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron. This was during the first day of the tabernacle's services. The first day of Nisan, so it's 2 weeks shy of a year after the Exodus. All the building's done, all the vessels are done, all the vestments are done. It's time to inaugurate the tabernacle. And there are 12 days of tributes where the heads of every tribe bring an offering, a special tribute for 12 days, starting with the 1st of Nisan to the 12th of Nisan. 7 days prior, Moshe served as the high priest. He wore the vestments of the high priest. He assembled and disassembled the tabernacle each day. And the most momentous day of them all, the first day of Nisan, when finally the presence of God rests in the tabernacle. The Almighty has a permanent station, an embassy of sorts amongst his people. And during that day, the two sons of Aaron, the two future heirs, the heir apparent of Aaron and of Moshe. People who, the Torah tells us, who Moshe confesses were greater than him and Aaron. They brought an unauthorized sacrifice. They brought ketores, incense, into the Holy of Holies, a foreign fire that was not commanded by God, and a fire emitted from before God and consumed them, and they died. The happiest day, the most jubilant day, was marred by this terrible tragedy. Now, what exactly are the reasons why they died or why they did what they did? It's very much debated. There really is no consensus. One year I assembled 12 different reasons featured in the commentaries and in the sages and in the classic literature as to what they did wrong. These were absolute titans, and this was not just, let's go in, let's have a good time and party in the tabernacle. There's something much more deep and much more profound and subtle and nuanced, but they died. They died, and we revisit this each year. On Yom Kippur, the reading of Yom Kippur is the death of the two sons of Aaron and its aftermath. But after these two princes of the Jewish people died, so we have the immediate aftermath of that. We have to remove the bodies, we have to bury the bodies, but what to do with the three remaining Kohanim? The Kohanim are the family of Aaron. It's part of the tribe of Levi, of the Levites, but there's one family, the family of Aaron, that is consecrated as Kohanim, as priests. Aaron and his 4 sons, they have a special anointing oil that is poured over them, and they are Kohanim, and no one else can be a Kohen. If you're not part of this family alone, you are not qualified. So we had 5 Kohanim. We're down to 3. That's it. What is the behavior of those 3 people? They're mourners, right? They just lost their relative. What is the proper behavior for them? That's discussed in the Torah. So Moshe tells Aaron and Aaron's 2 remaining sons, Elazar and Itamar, your hair, don't allow it to grow out. Typically, a mourner must not receive a haircut. That's part of the mourning process. The Kohen is different. And certainly these Kohanim, these are the only Kohanim in the world. We need them to do the service. They are not mourning the way typical mourners do. Your garment do not rend. A mourner must rend their garment. They must not do that. And if they do that, they shall die. Don't do it and don't die. If you do it, you will die. And yes, it's necessary to mourn these 2 giants who passed, but that is done by the populace, by the house of Israel. The whole nation will mourn. You will not mourn. You must not leave the Ohel Moed, the tabernacle. If you do, you will die. So these are instructions that were given to these 3 remaining Kohanim in the aftermath of the death of Nadav and Avihu, but the laws are actually applied across the board universally. Forever, these laws, a Kohen may not wear torn garments in the temple. A Kohen may not allow his hair to grow out in the temple. A Kohen must not leave the temple grounds in middle of the service. And then the verse continues, God spoke to Aaron saying, don't drink, no alcohol and no intoxicants. That is the 4th law. And this is because, according to one opinion, Nadav and Avihu were actually under the influence, and that's why they died. Again, they're told, don't drink any wine or intoxicants when you come to the Mishkan, when you come to the tabernacle, velo samusa, and you shall not die. The Kohanim, they have a very short leash. Their job is so important. Their role is so sacrosanct. If they behave in a way that's not fitting for the priest, and if they certainly walk into the temple or to the tabernacle, and they do things that are off, that is a capital offense, and they would be killed. Important to note, the verse talks about not dying. This is not adjudicated by a human court. A human court does not adjudicate these laws of priestly decorum. It is what's known as Misa B'nei Shemaim, death at the hands of heaven. They're guilty of a capital crime if they violate this, but it's not adjudicated by the human court. It is adjudicated by the heavenly court. So these are the 4 mitzvos that we're going to discuss today. If you're a Kohen, not just those 3 original Kohanim, the survivors, but any Kohen, they may not enter the temple with long hair. Long hair, that's the practice, that's the behavior, that's the custom of mourners. It's not done in the temple. If your hair is unshorn, you cannot enter temple grounds, and you certainly cannot do service in the temple. Now, even though this is referring, the context is mourners, the prohibition is not limited to mourners. If a Kohen has a long mane, has a long hair, they're not permitted to enter the temple, even if that long hair is for stylistic reasons or something else. That's their vibe, whatever it may be. They are prohibited from entering the temple with overgrown hair. Now, how long is long? So it's interesting. The Torah tells us that the Kohanim cannot grow their hair out. There is someone else who must grow their hair out, namely the Nazir, someone who accepts a vow to be a Nazir. Well, how long is a typical Nazir period? It's 30 days. Thus, the definition of long hair is a 30-day growth, and therefore, a Nazir must allow their hair to grow out for 30 days. A Kohen may not have long hair, and thus the definition of that is a 30-day growth. That's the evidence that long hair, the definition of that is a 30 days growth. A Kohen cannot have that. And the Sefer Chinuch, which is the book that we are using to go through the mitzvos, he offers a rationale, a reason, an understandable reason that we can process for every mitzvah. And he says an idea that's obvious. This is the house of God. And the house of God, it must be important. It must have prestige. It cannot be a place where vagabonds are walking around. It's like the Yankees, okay. I grew up a Mets fan. But the Yankees, like, we're the Yankees. We're the Bronx Bombers. They don't allow any of their players to have facial hair. You have to look like a Yankee. Okay, so that's their practice. Okay, come on. Does it really matter? The hockey players have these big playoff beards, these bushy beards, toothless smiles. But when it comes to the Yankees, we have the prestige. The pinstripes, this is the Yankees. You cannot have, I don't think they'll allow long hair either. But certainly, if you walk into the temple, if you walk in, the president, right? You always wonder, like what would happen if a president says, I'm just going through a phase. I'm going to grow out a beard and look cool and suave. We haven't had a bearded president, I think, since the 19th century. It's been a long time. I don't know, J.D. Vance, who's the incoming vice president, I think he has a nice beard. Looks better with a beard. But which man doesn't look better with a beard? Should you imagine Trump with a beard, or even Biden with a nice bushy white beard? But they don't do it. Why? President, dignity, you have to look proper, gotta get your nice haircut, well trimmed, professional, because you're the president. There has to be prestige. There has to be a certain class. That's the way it has to be. The temple has to have the most class, the most prestige of any place. You cannot have people to be unprofessional, people to not be well groomed to walk into the Almighty's home in this world. And they cite a precedent from the book of Esther. When Mordechai was mourning, he wore sackcloth. But he went all the way to the entrance of the palace, but didn't go quite into the palace. You cannot walk to the gate of the king, it's not befitting to walk into the house of royalty dressed in a mourning fashion. And therefore, when you walk into the temple, the house of the king of kings, the palace of all palaces, it's only with joy and with a certain upstanding professionalism, not as a mourner, not as someone who's sad, not as someone who is despondent. There's the proper decorum. And of course, it's not just for the Kohen, it's for all of us. When we realize the premise of the temple, and that's to elevate us all, and to have us ascend and transcend above the pettiness of sin, the pettiness of physical, corporeal life, to realize that we're a soul, that we can have a connection with the Almighty, that He cares about us, to elevate us above pettiness. To do that, it's important to have all the different elements in place. All the different components in place. All the different accoutrements of royalty. With honor, with gravitas, with seriousness, with joy. That is the proper setting for the temple and its lessons to be imparted to us. Now, an ordinary Kohen, suppose they're on vacation. They're taking a month off. They're doing a sabbatical. Typical Kohen comes to the temple twice a year, or 2 weeks a year. That's what they do. Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is there the whole time. Typical Kohen, they have the different shifts and rotating shifts. Come for 2 weeks or so a year. The rest of the time, they could be an accountant. They could go on vacation, go hike the Himalayas, travel through Europe. They could, not necessarily advised, but they could. When they do that, they could allow their hair to grow a bit more. But once they walk into the temple, and certainly once they do work in the temple, they must not have long hair. And if they do, the consequences are severe. If they do work with long hair, it's capital punishment adjudicated by heaven. But their service is fine. I mean, if they bring a sacrifice, that sacrifice does not have to be redone. The service is fine. Mitzvah number 150 is very similar in that a Kohen cannot walk into the temple with torn garments. Even though this is referring to mourners, that's the context, all priests may not enter the temple with rent garments. And if they do the service again, there's the death penalty. And if they don't do the service, there's a very long dispute here that he brings. The Sefer Chinuch brings between the Ramban and the Rambam, a very complicated dispute as to exactly what the prohibition is. But for our purposes, I think the lesson is the same, that the temple, it connotes a certain change in philosophy that it's supposed to impart upon the visitors, and the Kohanim must dress the part. Now, incidentally, this is the source that mourners must grow their hair out and must rend their garment. I mean, this is the exception. The Kohanim, and certainly the family of the Kohanim in this original episode, they're the exceptions. Ordinary mourners, well, they may not cut their, and they must rend their garment. And the reason why mourners have to mourn, what's the reason for that? So part of it is rehabilitory, right? If you lose a relative and you're so mired in sadness and depression, it's important to embrace that and to not suppress that. It's a big mistake to try to cover it up, to paper it over. You do that, then you're not actually addressing the pain that needs to be addressed. If you're just suppressing it, it will surface at a later point. So it's actually very healthy to embrace the pain. But there's more. When someone passes, they're being judged. And the judgment in heaven is very fierce. It's very harsh. And our job, those of us who are still fortunate enough to be alive, we have to empathize with the departed. And therefore there's the scale of judgment that happens in heaven, and there's the corresponding scale of mourning that happens over here. Whatever your dear departed is undergoing in heaven, you try to the best of your ability to empathize with them, and of course to learn lessons of how you can make sure that you live on a higher level, that you improve. That's the job of the mourner. And thus the day of the burial, that's 1 degree of heavenly judgment, and thus 1 degree of mourning. And then the Shiva, the 7 days, the 30 days, the first year, and so on. In every stage of judgment that the departed is undergoing in heaven, we try to empathize with them to the best of our ability and try to help them and ease their state, of course. They can no longer do mitzvahs, we can do mitzvahs on their behalf and thus elevate their soul in heaven. And part of that is to mourn, and part of that is the external trappings of mourning, namely the long hair and the rent garments. Now suppose someone's getting a haircut. Very interesting law that I read. He's getting a haircut. Halfway through the haircut, he finds out, unfortunately, his father passed away. Is he allowed to finish the haircut? The answer is yes. Yes, that would be appropriate to finish the haircut, even though he's a mourner. If it's just like a half a haircut, I always get nervous. I get my boys' haircuts. Like, what if the machine just breaks down? I have a backup machine, but I was worried, like, what if we stop now? I always tell the kids, okay, should we stop now? And it's like, it's halfway done. Just missing a little patch in the back. Should we stop here? So no, that's not the point. The point is not that they look like a goofball, like an oddball. The point is that they mourn, and part of it's the haircut, but if they discover mid-haircut, the haircut is allowed to be finished. Now, what's the point of rending the garments, of ripping the garments? So simply put, it's just, garments are what we wear. Garments give us a certain standing amongst society. And if you rip that, it's a sign of mourning. But on a deeper level, some of the commentaries tell us that there's a very important analogy that clothing serves. When does humanity get clothing? It's not at the very, very beginning. It's only after the sin of Adam. Why? Prior to the sin of Adam, the body and the soul had a very different relationship than they had after the sin of Adam. To us, we have a body and soul, but the body is very primary. The soul is concealed. Before the sin, the soul was primary, was dominant, and the body was an afterthought. So clothing, garments to cover what's there was not really a central part or thinking of humanity. Because our essence, the soul was dominant. Now the soul gets covered up. We kind of indicate that by covering up a garment for the body, just as the body is a garment for the soul. And that's when there's someone dies and we think about what they're undergoing and we think about judgment, we think about what life really is all about. We try to realign our priorities. People on their deathbed, they often talk about how, they have regrets. They should have done this. They should have done that. Once they realize their own mortality, once their demise is around the corner, they think more clearly. Which is why, if you remember the day of death, you'll be able to overcome the Yetzer Hara. When someone is in that experience of thinking about what life is really about, well then it's important to rip the garment, so to speak, to realize that the physicality, the garment of the soul, well, that's not really so important. That's not really primary. That's not really dominant. Mitzvah number 151 is a prohibition against the priests leaving the temple grounds, tabernacle grounds during the service. So this is a prohibition in the middle of a service, but there's actually a law that says that a priest may participate in a funeral even though the funeral will make them impure if it's one of the 7 close relatives: father, mother, sister, brother, son, daughter, and wife. A high priest may never become impure even to those 7 close relatives. And thus this prohibition that the Kohanim may not leave the service, even though it's applied universally, meaning even after the events described in Leviticus 10, it's applied to not leave the service, the temple grounds, in the middle of the service. An ordinary Kohen may leave the temple grounds for a funeral, provided that they're not in the middle of a service. However, a high priest may never leave the temple grounds, even though there is an opinion they may follow the funeral at a distance, but they must remain, so to speak, in a state of holiness, or, according to one opinion, literally in the temple grounds. The prohibition against leaving is across the board. Now, the commentaries tell us here, Sefer Chinuch tells us, the reason behind this is that this is a very important thing. Some things are too important to stop in the middle of. And when someone is in the middle of doing service of God in the holy temple, no matter what, cannot stop. There's the parade outside, the circus is here. You cannot stop, no matter what. And I think maybe this is another good lesson for us. We have to realize, so the Kohen is doing service of God. That's more important than anything else. We have a version of service of God of our own. That's prayer. And the Mishnah tells us about the importance of seriousness while prayer. And it talks about the early pious ones who would wait an hour before prayer to clear their mind, so they have the proper gravity when it comes to prayer, to be able to have the devotion needed to have their full heart engaged in prayer. And then the Mishnah says, even if a king passes by, King Charles, he happens to visit the shul and you're in the middle of your prayer, and he walks over to you and says, pleasure to meet you. I don't know, that was probably a bad invitation. What do? You're in the middle of prayer. You don't stop. You're talking to God, King of Kings. You don't stop even to greet a king. And then the Mishnah says, well, what if you look down and you see that there is a snake coiling around your leg? you don't stop prayer. You let it shake off your leg. But you don't stop prayer. Because you're talking to God. It's that important. Now the law states, but if you see a scorpion who tends to be a bit more violent, then you would stop. And if you see that the snake is really angry and wants to damage you, then you would stop. But the point is that the examples that it gives, it's important for us to realize what we're doing. We have a version of service of our own, and we cannot interrupt that for basically anything. And I think we have it backwards, and we talk about the body and soul and the relationship and the hierarchy. You know, people go to the theater, go to the movies, go to the games, and they want to get there on time. And they even spend in football, they have the tailgate parties, right? They get there 6 a.m. and they're preparing. If our prayer starts at 9, maybe we should also have a tailgate for the prayer. Get there and get all hyped up for prayer. That's what the early pious ones used to do. But many people, and I'm not trying to accuse anyone of anything that I'm not myself guilty of. You know, it's, you gotta be there in time for the game. Tip-off is at 7 a.m. You can't miss it. Opening, you don't miss the national anthem, right? The opening credits. But if you come to shul an hour late or 15 minutes late, it's okay. We're supposed to realize that the service of God is the greatest privilege that we have, and it's sacrosanct. And if a Kohen leaves the temple in middle of service, it's death penalty. Again, not adjudicated by a human court, but it's very severe. And we have a version of that ourselves. And finally, mitzvah number 152, to not enter the temple inebriated, in addition to not render rulings, halachic rulings, under the influence. Well, how much wine or inebriation inducing liquids is enough? So the law states that there's a revius, which is a quarter of a log. What does that mean? It means it's somewhere between 3 and 5 fluid ounces of undiluted wine. And this prohibition applies to wine and other intoxicants. The idea is you don't walk into the temple under the influence, and you certainly don't do any service in the temple if you are a Kohen under the influence. And again, the Sefer Chinuch gives us the reason for the mitzvah, or at least a reason for the mitzvah. And he says it's obvious. I don't even need to explain it to you. You have to have a settled mind when engaging in the most holy and sacred of pursuits. And if you're under the influence, that's not the proper state of mind for service of God. And I will tell you that in general, the sages don't have the most positive things to say about alcohol and drunkenness. The Mishnah says, for example, it lists a list of things, a litany of things that remove a person from the world. And one of them is afternoon wine. And the Rambam in his commentary says, if someone's a drunk, they're a sinner. Very harsh words that he uses. And they're shameful. And they lose their wisdom. And if they get drunk in front of the common folk, well, then they're also desecrating the name of God. And it's prohibited to drink afternoon wine, or as we call it, a liquid lunch. It's prohibited even a little bit, unless you're having that as part of your meal, because it helps you with the digestion and does make you drunk. But if it's just to get a little tipsy in the afternoon, it is prohibited. And the commentaries, they offer a variety of different insights to understand this. I'm not much of a drinker, but from what I understand, it makes people happy. What's wrong, philosophically, with a bit of wine? So the commentaries offer a few different perspectives on this. One idea is that we do want to affect our psychological state, but we want our psychological state to be uplifted, to be made merrier as a result of concrete reality, of our intellect, of our understanding. When someone understands something very deep, very profound, their mood improves. But it's not artificial. It's real. Someone may be a bit nervous to walk into the temple and say, hey, take the edge off, have a shot or two. One of the commentaries explains that the temple was supposed to be a transformative and enriching experience. And you should emerge from the experience joyous and uplifted. But it should be the result of something substantial, not something artificial. You should have an emotional high, but have an emotional high as a result of the actual experience of walking into God's home. You should develop authentic feelings, emotional highs that are a result of reality. I think in general this is a nice idea. We all want to feel good. We all need some dopamine. We all need some joy in our life. We all pursue happiness and pleasure. That's normal. The only difference that we have with others and other systems is that we want it to be the result of reality, where you work hard towards something and you get a dose of dopamine as a result, where you're productive and you get some dopamine as a result, where you do something kind and difficult, but you overcome and you get a great feeling of triumph. And what we don't want is people finding artificial ways, just substances and chemicals and things like that to get an artificial way to achieve that high. And certainly in the temple is the most powerful way to uplift someone and to transform someone. You want to make sure that the experience is authentic, it's real, it's based on substance, but not substance of alcohol, the substance of the experience in the temple. So we have 4 mitzvahs here that mostly relate to the priests, even though there are some lessons that we can deduce for ourselves. 149 to 152. A Kohen may not have overgrown hair and do work in the temple or even enter the temple. Cannot have ripped garments and do work in the temple or even enter the temple. Cannot leave the temple in the middle of the service and cannot be inebriated, nor can any visitor to the temple be inebriated, and nor can someone who is a judge on matters of Torah, they cannot rule when they are under the influence. Mitzvos 149 through 152. We're back. It's been a while, but hopefully we'll continue to do some more mitzvos on our mitzvah podcast and our mitzvah series. And of course, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.